Hello, everyone, and welcome to Attitudes Weekly ADHD Experts webinar. Glad you can be with us. So many of our kids have started school, or will probably be doing so right after Labor Day. So it's a good time to be talking about how to motivate our students as teachers and parents to help their kids do their best during the school year. Jerome Schultz, a former special education teacher and a clinical neuropsychologist, will be helping us come up with a game plan to do that. Today, we'll discuss the science behind how the ADHD brain works and learn the key differences between an ADHD brain and a neurotypical one in terms of what motivates each of them. Then Dr. Schultz will give us practical tools to help kids tune in to what is being taught in the classroom, which I think is exactly what parents and teachers need and want at this point. So let me introduce Dr. Schultz. He's the author of a wonderful book, Nowhere to Hide, Why Kids with ADHD and LD Hate School and What We Can Do About It. I've actually read it twice, so I highly recommend it. He is on the faculty of Harvard Medical School and has been working with kids with ADHD and LD for 35 years. He writes regularly for Attitude Magazine. If you missed any of his articles, you can find them on attitudemag.com. I'd also like to give a big thank you to today's webinar sponsor, Esteem Thrive. It is a new app that will give you insights, resources, and instructions for dealing with important challenges we all come up against as parents. You know, things like medication, falling behind in school, knowing what to do when the strategies you're using aren't working. With everyone now going back to school, you can get a free trial of Esteem Thrive by logging on to chooseesteem.com, and you should see how it works for you. I wanted to do a little poll to ask you about your child's biggest motivation challenge. That way, Dr. Schultz can tailor some of his remarks specifically to those challenges. So as you take that, I'd like to mention a few things about our webinar interface. The widgets on your screen are completely resizable and movable. You can submit your questions through the Q&A widget, and Dr. Schultz will answer them after you finish talking. One important thing, the webinar is streamed through your computer and the internet, so it is bandwidth intensive. For the optimal experience, it's probably best to close any programs that are running in the background. Now let's see the results of the poll. Okay, interesting. I don't want to do this. It's the overwhelming challenge. Yeah. There's no value in doing this. Yes, very interesting. So with that in mind, let me turn it over to Dr. Schultz, who will talk about how we can light the fire of inspiration and motivation under our kids.
Hi, Wayne. Thanks for that great introduction. Happy to be working with you and Attitude Magazine again. Especially looking forward to doing this presentation. As I talked to you just before we went on the air, doing a webinar for you is always a good opportunity for me to challenge the ideas and views that I have as a professional, but also to add to my knowledge base. So for me, doing this webinar is a learning experience as well, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to share my thoughts and some facts and some data with the listening audience. I'm so great that so many of you could tune in to this, the live presentation, or some of you will do this later are listening to this later on a rebroadcast. So I've started out with a definition of motivation just to get us on the same page, so to speak. I pulled this from a fellow named Richard Daft, who in 2006 wrote an article about it, but he defines motivation as you see before you here, the forces either within or external to a person that arouse enthusiasm and persistence to pursue a certain course of action. It's a good general definition of motivation. And I want to use that as kind of the baseline in our discussion in talking about kids with ADHD and learning disabilities and related challenges, and why that definition begs a little bit of differentiation as we go forward. Excuse me just a minute. I want to move ahead here in the slide. Let's start with you. What motivated you to tune into this webinar? And let's look at what the theory is behind your motivation to get excited by something and act on it. Perhaps you were attracted by something that researchers call intrinsic motivation. This means that you value learning for its own sake. You have a great desire to expand your knowledge. You want to increase your skill level. Maybe you tuned in because you want to find out if you know as much or more than I know about this topic. I put a smiley face in there because I'm smiling about that, but you might. And in the Q&A period at the end of the session, not only can you ask questions of me that I might respond to, but you might even present information in your question that other people and I may not be aware of. So you may have tuned in because you wanted to get something out of this. You wanted to appeal to your extrinsic motivation sense, the desire to acquire knowledge that may enrich you or your professional skills, your parenting skills in some way. This might improve your ability to reach out and teach kids with ADHD. You might want to impress your boss. You may be trying to get professional development points for doing an activity like this. If you're a parent, it might improve your parenting skills and, as a consequence, reduce stress in your family. So intrinsic motivation, that is being motivated by something outside yourself, has two sides to it. This paragraph looks at how you do something to get something positive. We can also look at extrinsic motivation as something that helps you avoid some negative consequences. You may be tuning into this webinar because you or somebody else said, hey, you're not really good at this. You need to improve your skills at managing or motivating kids. And you signed in here because you want to get them off your back. You want to prove them wrong. So extrinsic motivation is not only to bring rewards to yourself, but you may be motivated by some external force that's making you unpleasant. You may be tired of the stress and tension you have at home over getting your kids motivated, or you might be tired of getting all these negative reports from school. And so I want to use these examples by putting you at the center of these so you can understand how these factors play a role also in the lives of kids and young adults that we're here to talk about. It's likely also that you have positive perceptions today. That is that you think that you have the ability to perform the task of participating in this webinar. You also believe or you hope that you're going to benefit from the webinar and that you have the ability to understand what's going to be presented here. And also you have the desire to apply this knowledge. This is a reference to what's called the expectancy theory of motivation. You think about that for some of the kids that we work with and care about. If you have a negative perception of your ability, people who have a really negative perception about this webinar didn't tune in. They say, well, he's going to talk about brain science, and I don't want to hear all about that. I don't understand that. It confuses me. Or he's not going to have practical suggestions, or I have heard this before. So if you have a negative perception about something, your brain shuts down, you don't pick up the phone to dial in, and you don't turn on your computer. The same thing happens to kids in classrooms. So we're going to try to use this basic knowledge of the theories behind motivation to help us deal with it. You also probably believe, if you tuned in today, that you have the capacity to change and to grow by doing the things that you will learn about in this webinar. So if you know the work of Carol Dweck, which I highly recommend, you also have what's called a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. Some of you may know that a fixed mindset is the state of mind that says, you know, I'm not going to grow, I'm not going to change, I am what I am. You can do anything you want to do to me, you can try to teach me, you can shove information into my head, but I am not very smart, I'm not very capable, and that's just the way I am. The growth mindset, on the other hand, is the kind of mindset that says, you know what, I am intelligent, but my knowledge base may be limited. If I expose myself to some of that information that's available to me, I can learn better and learn more. And that would be a growth mindset. I'm sorry if I faded out in the beginning of my conversation with you. I've gotten a little closer to the microphone here, and I hope that's helpful to you. Traditional views of motivation apply to everybody, every kid, every adult, every adolescent. But if these traditional approaches were effective for kids with ADHD, you might not even be listening to this webinar. You wouldn't have this as a problem. The real problem is that these traditional approaches fall short, and I think there's a single central reason why that happens. Why these traditional approaches don't seem to work very well with kids with ADHD. And because they don't work very well, we have a lot of kids, a lot of teachers, a lot of parents who are frustrated and stressed. Here's what I think the central answer is, and I want to make the case today to support this answer. The brain of a person with ADHD is in fact different from the brain of someone who does not have this condition. I didn't say better than, I didn't say worse than, but it is clearly different. And if it's different, folks with this condition, kids or adolescents or adults, need to have a different approach, may need a different approach to be motivated. Let me present you with some evidence that underscores the idea that the brains of people with ADHD are different. I know there are a lot of debates about this in the professional community. A lot of people don't like to use the word disability or disorder. People like to talk about attitudinal or attentional differences or learning differences, and I understand why there might be some resistance to that. But if you have a kid or a family member who has ADHD, we have to acknowledge the fact that it's a neurologically based condition. It's a diagnosis that people can get or cannot get. And I think it's important to understand the evidence, because if we don't believe that it's a neurologically based condition, then we'll react to it as if it's just another way of thinking. And we won't do the interventions that tend to make the differences that we like to see. Let's consider these kinds of things. Brain imaging studies show that kids with ADHD are significantly smaller than other kids. The brains of these kids are smaller. It doesn't have anything to do with intelligence, but it has to do with the cellular structure of the brains. There are reductions that you can see on brain imaging studies in both the volume and the thickness in certain parts of the gray matter of the brain. I'll say to you, it doesn't matter whether you know what gray matter is, but we'll get into that in a little bit more. But the brains of these kids are different. You can see it on fMRI imaging studies or fMRI, functional magnetic resonance studies. Most people with ADHD don't have those kind of brain scans, so we're going to have to assume that if it's true for most kids with ADHD, we have to assume that it's true for kids who have a thorough diagnosis and get a confirmed diagnosis of this condition, that their brains are in fact different. There's a part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, another part called the basal ganglia, the cerebellum of the brain, the back part of the brain. All of these are affected, and there is increasing evidence that suggests that the connections between and among these parts of the brain are different and ineffective or inefficient in the brains of kids with ADHD. We also, I mentioned fMRI studies, functional magnetic resonance imaging studies, have demonstrated that the electrochemical activity in the front part of the brain, the frontal lobe of the brain, like if you reach up and touch your forehead now, that's about where that is, and in the middle part of the brain, the inside of the brain, a part called the striatum, that these parts of the brain show abnormal brain activity. Think about this for a minute. Just very simply, if the frontal part of the brain has to do with the executive functions, that is, thinking about thinking, planning, organization, your memory function, and the middle part of the brain, the old part of our brain, has to do with emotions, think about this. If there's a different kind of activity in both of those areas in kids who have ADHD, then we see that there's a connection between emotions and thinking, and both of those might be different in kids with ADHD. Hang on to that thought as we move along in this discussion. We also have studies of the electrical activity in the brain that shows that people with ADHD have a difficult time not responding, not paying attention to irrelevant stimuli. Think about that. People with ADHD have a difficult time not paying attention to things that they don't need to be paying attention to. This won't come as a surprise to most people in the listening audience, but we have neurological studies that allow us to confirm this. This means that kids with ADHD need to do something active, something different, to trigger their ability to inhibit. That means to stop paying attention to things that they don't need to be paying attention to. They need to do this earlier, and they need to do it more strongly to achieve the same goals as kids who don't have this condition. So just to replay that in other language, kids with ADHD pay too much attention to things that are irrelevant to the task at hand, and in order to bypass that or get around that, they have to intervene themselves, they have to change themselves earlier, and they have to be more stronger in their efforts. They have to work harder in order to acquire the information or pay attention to the, and that's an important fact to understand, because if we don't understand that, and we keep saying to kids, well, you just have to do this, we have to realize that there's a neurological basis for this. Here, I think, is the most important factor in this whole discussion of ADHD and motivation. We know through good brain science that ADHD has been linked to the intermittent production or intermittent underproduction of a compound called dopamine. Dopamine acts as a transmitter. It carries messages from one part of the brain to another. And dopamine is the compound that allows us to use the parts of our brain efficiently. Among other things, this compound called dopamine promotes desire. It's the compound that gets produced when we see something that we want to do or we think about something that we want to do. So it follows logically from that definition that if we don't have desire to do something, our dopamine level decreases. If we have low dopamine, our desire to do something may be inhibited. So think about that as we continue through the discussion. I know some of this can be depressing because we're saying, oh my goodness, this guy, a neuroscientist, is saying there are things that are going on in the brain of my brain or the brain of my kids or my students, and that sounds like something that we can't do anything about. Well, that's the farthest thing from the truth. If I believe there weren't things that we could do something about, I wouldn't be doing this webinar, and I wouldn't be as optimistic as I am about the opportunity to help kids change and perform in better ways. We have neurons or nerve cells in our brain that control the production of this compound called dopamine. And they're produced primarily in two parts of the midbrain, or sometimes what's called the primitive part of our brain. I'll show you a picture of this in just a moment. In the olden days, before we developed into the smart thinking humans that we are today, we had still the primitive brain, the center of our brain, the midbrain, which governed the things that kept us alive, that regulated our breathing, that told us when to be afraid, that told us when to run, told us when to hide, told us how to stay alive and how to survive. That part of our brain still exists. Fortunately, through evolution, we have another part of our brain that helps us think about those primitive impulses, and we have the ability to judge how serious those messages are, how based in fact those messages are, and we can think about those a lot, and we can override those. But let's look at these two areas of the brain. One is called the substantial nigra. We're not going to look at that area today except in the picture. We're going to focus more on something called the ventral tegmental area, or the shorthand for that is VTA. Here's a cutaway view of the brain, and you can see if you look carefully at this. I don't have a pointer to use, but you can see the VTA somewhere located in the center of that brain. You see that little cauliflower-shaped organ? That's the cerebellum of the brain on the right-hand side. And if you look down below that, you have SN, the substantial nigra. If you look at the VTA area and look at those neural pathways, those lines coming out of that area, take a look at where those go. Take a look at the blue line from the VTA and follow that up just behind the eye, and you see the branching there, and see where that ends up. That's the prefrontal cortex. So you can see how the area that produces dopamine, called the VTA, projects or broadcasts this neurochemical information up to the prefrontal lobe. If you take a look now at the red line, the red pathway coming out of that VTA, you can see how that goes to the striatum. And in the striatum, that's the part of the primitive part of the brain, the midbrain. A lot of this area in the brown here is that. But that's the part of our brain that has to do with registering danger, with registering pleasure, with registering fear and avoidance. So you can see biologically that there's a part of our brain that's responsible for producing a chemical that allows for the flow of information to go to our prefrontal cortex and to our emotional center of our brain. That's the biological underpinning of everything that I'm going to talk about today. The dopamine-related neurons of the VTA are connected to the limbic system. That's where the striatum. The limbic system is the feeling system of our brain. It controls our emotions, our reactions to pleasure and reward, and success and failure. So I'm thinking at this point, this has got to begin to start making sense to you about why motivation is so difficult, because these parts of the brain are involved, and these parts of the brain are different than the brains of most other people. So here we can think about, when we concern ourselves with the limbic system, we can think about motivation. The VTA, as I said, also goes to the prefrontal cortex, the blue line going up to the front of the brain. That brain is responsible for that part of the brain is responsible for a lot of things, but primarily for executive functioning, which we know is often weak in kids and individuals with ADHD. So it's important to think about those kind of connections as underpinning this discussion and our understanding of motivation. Here we have to think about organization, planning, and memory. Look at how those two things go together and what happens when they don't work well together. So the challenge is helping those parts of the brain work better, work more efficiently, so that motivation is enhanced. Intriguing, yes. I hope you think so. I think it's incredibly intriguing. Before I became a neuropsychologist, I used to hear things from people about motivation, like my father saying to me at work, you need to work harder, you need to try harder. If you work harder, I'll give you a raise. If you don't work harder, I'll fire you. Well, it was my dad, so there were a lot of emotions tied into this, but my executive functioning at that point was going crazy because I had no idea that it was something that was going on in my brain, but something I just thought it was an attitude. Well, it's much more than that. Here's a little sidebar here. Why do stimulant medications work when they work? Why are they helpful with people with ADHD? These stimulant medications target the transporters, the little vehicles, if you will, in the brain, which carry dopamine, which allow dopamine and therefore more communication to flow from brain cell to brain cell. So there's a biological difference in the brains of people with ADHD, and for those for whom it works, stimulant medications help to correct that imbalance. Again, it's a topic that has a lot of debate associated with it, but I'm trying to help you understand what I know about the science of this. Let's go back to the evidence for brain differences. We also have genetic research that shows that there may be a strong genetic component to ADHD. It often appears to run in families. There's a good source here. There's a link to an article that you can look at from the Child Neurology Foundation to learn more about that and several of the other things that I've presented in the previous couple of slides. Think about this factor, too, the issue of what's called comorbidity. It's not a very happy word, but it means that ADHD often coexists with one or more other additional neurological conditions. And this combination of conditions, which often happen in people with ADHD, often increase the challenges that are associated with ADHD. Think about this. About 2/3 of the kids diagnosed with ADHD have some other condition, like a learning disability. Some kids have autism. Some kids have epilepsy. Some kids have Tourette's syndrome. People with cerebral palsy have a higher incidence than typical kids of having ADHD. And there are other emotional disorders like anxiety or depression. So we really have to know how if those other factors exist in the people that we care about, but we have to know how those different conditions interact with the ADHD and how they help it or hurt it or get in the way of it. So that's an important thing to consider. The other thing that I would add to this is there's what I have come to call a cumulative toxicity to all these factors.
kids with ADHD tend to have more experiences with frustration and failure than they have with success. You think about it. You have a condition that makes learning in school difficult for you, makes paying attention to important things difficult for you, and that's what schooling is all about. So I think that you can have a buildup of these conditions over time, this difficulty, and it builds up over time. And we need to really break the cycle. We have to allow kids who have ADHD to have more experiences with success than they do with frustration and failure. Otherwise, their brains are in escape mode, and they're trying over and over again to get away from the things that we really need them to do and what they need to do. So I think unless this condition that we call ADHD is dealt with in a really systematic and scientific manner throughout the lifespan, this is not just a problem for adolescents, it's not a problem for adults, it's a problem for very little kids. Hang on for a second, that's my smoke alarm going off. Sorry, hang on. I think I am not in danger, but all the stress mechanisms of my body just started to act up. Hang on one second. Sorry about that. So what's happening right now? Now I lost it, so we're good. Sorry about that, but it's a great demonstration of what happens when the danger signal goes off in your brain. My brain told my body to make my feet move and get up and check out why this was happening. The prefrontal cortex was saying, Jerry, you're doing a webinar here. Keep talking, because otherwise this is going to end up being a very unsuccessful experience. Anyway, with that aside, Wayne, can you still hear me? I want to make sure that I'm live.
Yes, everything's fine.
Okay. Now my cortisol levels have gone back down. I think I'm safe, and we'll go on ahead to the next. This whole thing affects this condition, this cumulative toxicities, building up of negative emotions about this, affects self-perception, what we think of ourselves. It actually affects brain function. I just talked to you kind of jokingly about cortisol, another chemical in the brain, that actually unabated, when cortisol comes out and is overproduced in your brain actually experiences changes because of that chemical compound. So the more uncontrolled stress we have, the greater the likelihood that a brain that works differently may work even more inefficiently. So all of this affects motivation. But again, let's stay optimistic here. So when people say to us that these kids about kids who seem not to be motivated, we hear, oh, that's just in your head. You can get over that. Well, they're right. It is in your head, but about 98% of what we do is in our head. But as I say here, it ain't just about attitude, folks. It's about neurobiology. Now, that doesn't mean you can't have a kid who just doesn't feel like doing something. We all feel like that sometimes. But here I'm trying to make the case that people who have ADHD may be processing this stimulation a little bit differently, and in order for us to deal with it, we have to acknowledge that and understand it. If you, as a listener, aren't convinced, or if the other person who's not here listening isn't convinced, if a spouse or a partner, or if you have a teacher in your child's school who doesn't accept the reality that ADHD is a neurological condition and that it has consequences when it's unaddressed, I recommend this article that you're linked to below in Attitude magazine called Stop Fighting Your Child's Neurodiversity, a step-by-step plan for parents in diagnostic or diagnosis denial. An excellent article. We won't spend more time on that here, but if you need help in that area, it's a great resource for you. So what do we see when we hear kids, and what do we see and hear when we are working with kids who have poor motivation? This relates to the poll that you took earlier in the presentation. They may display a lack of desire. They may say or show to us in their behavior, they say, I don't want to do this. And they may not want to do this, and that doesn't mean that they won't do it, but that's a barrier that gets in the way. When we think negative thoughts about the task that lies before us, our brain responds in a way to help us protect us from negative kinds of things. So the more negative we are about the things that we're exposed to, the more difficult it is for our brain to get motivated and turned on. We may see kids who say to us, "This is stupid. Why would I have to do this? I'll never have to know this later in life. This is irrelevant to me." And that's just another negative barrier. So we have to be prepared with language to say, yeah, you may think it's irrelevant to you, and it might be irrelevant right now, but let's look at next year's curriculum. Let's look at that vocational program you want to go into and see if they require this skill. Let's look at the college that you're thinking about, and let's try to take the long view and we have to try to help kids understand there's relevance in this, even if they don't feel that way. And it's not so much that they believe that it's irrelevant, but they see it as hard, they see it as difficult, they're worried that this next thing might happen. If I do this thing that you ask me to do, I will feel shamed. Some of the reasons that kids don't do what we put before them is because they don't want to look stupid. And as I said earlier, kids with ADHD tend to, because of their impulsivity, because of their distractibility, may tend to make more mistakes than other kids, and they have to suffer the consequences of that, which aren't always positive. These are kids who might want to avoid success. That seems strange, but think about it this way. What happens to a kid who's sitting with us and we're expecting that kid to do something and he doesn't or she doesn't? Some kids say, well, if I do this, first of all, it's really, really hard for me because I can't pay attention very well. It's hard for me to focus and sustain my attention. And guess what? If I do this, what is my teacher going to do? They're going to give me more of it. So it's better to kind of hide under the haze of the illusion of incompetence and not do it just to avoid this thing happening again. It's not like they're going from one pleasurable experience to the next. It's because they're going from one hard experience, and no matter what we say about the next one, they're going to believe that it's hard too. And I'll give you a suggestion a little bit later about how to deal with that one. They may have a desire to retain control. Kids, when they're doing this, tend to present with what I call a degree of aggressive passivity. Some kids even hold onto their chair if they're asked to go someplace else to do something. The attitude here is, you cannot make me do this. You just can't. I'm going to fight you. And a lot of these kids are very persistent. They can hang on to their opposition for a long, long time, long enough in some cases to get a secondary diagnosis of oppositional defiant disorder. Think about that. Think about oppositional defiant disorder as a way or the opposition that's a part of that condition as a way to protect you from being put into situations that are going to make you feel stupid. That's another topic for another time, but it's important to put that on the table. Kids with ADHD have notorious difficulty in delaying gratification. They keep their eyes on the prize, but only if it's a short-term prize. It's hard for a lot of kids with this condition to stay energized or sustain their effort towards some long-term goal. There's a lot of research that talks about large, late rewards, like graduating, like going on to the next grade, like being put in the next level class, by getting some kind of award. Those kind of reinforcements that happen later on versus small early rewards, tokens or prizes or points on a point checklist. Kids with ADHD tend to do better working for small early rewards, and that's important to understand that, because if we try to say, well, someday you'll need this, or if you do this, you're going to get that big thing at the end of the road. That big thing is, to a lot of kids, so unattainable that it just doesn't have any salience, doesn't have any value to them. So we really have to use early motivators and get kids to move from a period of success to another period of success. Kids with ADHD are thought to require stronger incentives to modify their behavior. I often say to kids when I'm working with them, if I give you a quarter, will you do this? No. If I give you $1, will you do this? And they keep looking at me and they look up and smile. I say, if I give you $100, would you do this? And they look up and they look quizzically and they say, well, maybe. I have to be very quick to say, well, I'm not going to give you $100. I'm just trying to figure out how much it would take to get you to do this thing. So you really have to understand the kind of the relative value of reinforcers here. We may think these things are reinforcing, but unless we engage kids in the selection of their own reinforcements, and unless we change them periodically based on them getting used to these reinforcers, we're not using behavioral technology as well as we can. There are a lot of kids who minimize the value of the reward. They say, I don't want good grades. I don't want to go to college. I don't want that stupid prize. And they minimize it because if they do, it decreases the need to be engaged in this, even if they don't believe this. We say things like, oh, sure you do. You know you want to. You've told me in another time that you want to go to college. So you understand, if we take away the long-term goal, if a child makes that go away, doing the work of the moment becomes less relevant. It looks like a lack of motivation, but it's really not. It's a smoke screen for fear. A lot of kids with ADHD, and this will come as no surprise to most people in the listening audience, have an attraction to other things that are more rewarding, more salient, other thoughts or ideas. We often see this phrase about kids with ADHD, ooh, look, a squirrel, which is kind of the joke to say, well, I'm supposed to be paying attention to my job here, but out the window, this squirrel is hopping along the top of my fence. That's why video games are so attractive to kids, because they give a lot of rewards very often, very powerfully. They change the reward. If you don't like the game, you can shut out of it. You can turn it off. You can pick another game. You can change the name of the player. You can remain anonymous. So we say, oh, I'm worried that addictions to video games are causing problems in motivation to kids. That's the wrong way to look at it. Video games are meeting the child who has this pattern of thinking and behavior exactly where he or she needs to be met. I'm not saying we as teachers and parents have to be just like video games, but we certainly have to understand the dynamics of that and learn from it. Otherwise, we can suffer the next two words, the disruptive behavior that we see in a lot of kids who look like they're not motivated, but really what they're doing is try to set up some camouflage to kind of get them out of the hot seat. Again, a topic for a longer discussion. A lot of kids with attention problems have EF weaknesses or problems with executive functioning. These are kids who say things like, if you listen to what they were thinking inside their heads, I can't get all these thoughts in my head. Everything that's necessary to do is I can't keep them all in my head at the same time, so I can't even get started. What do I do first? What do I do next? How can I hold on that outline, that sequence of things to do? So weak executive functioning may look like a lack of motivation, but think about it. If you have no idea what to do first or second, and you need every time you get into the situation, you need some adult hovering over you, telling you what to do first or second. That's embarrassing. It makes you feel weak. It makes you feel like you don't have much intelligence. So kids need to understand these things so they don't go to an I can't do it mode. Let's look for a brief second here at hot EF and cool EF. It's an interesting concept. First, I'll tell you a story. My wife and I were hiking in New Hampshire a week ago. I have the long view of the trail. I look ahead and I see the little trail blazes, the marks on the trail, because I have the GPS map in my pocket. I know where we're going. I'm not anxious. I'm not worried about bears. I don't have that anxiety in me, so I'm thinking with the frontal part of my brain. All I have to do is just look for that next marker, follow the trail, listen to the sound of traffic, and we're going to have a good time and we'll be out of here. My wife, on the other hand, is functioning from a more primitive part of her brain. That's not an insult. That's a compliment, because she's kept us alive in more than one situation. But she's displaying what's called hot EF. And hot EF, or hot executive functions, are those kind of executive functions that operate when we might be in trouble. We might have emotions associated with the thinking that we're doing. So she's looking left and right for every possible blaze or trail marker there is. She is looking ahead at the trail in the close near section of the trail for slippery spots or for moss-covered spots. So she's more thinking, let's get through this safely, and I'm thinking, let's just take the long view. Don't think too much, don't feel too much about this, just enjoy the moment. So the two of us are together on a hike are a great combination. She keeps us safe. I haven't broken anything, and I get us where we're going, and that's been a good thing so far. And we had a discussion about this just the other day, and she agrees with me, and I told her I was going to tell you, so I'm cool with that, and she's not hot with that. So anyway, hot EF is really good if you've got a passion towards something. If you say, wow, I want this more than anything, I love this more than anything, your executive functions will follow those hot, primitive emotions and get you there. If you have negative hot emotions, if you say, this scares me, that's a snake, that's a spider, it will hurt me, your EF shuts down in the service of survival. You don't think well at all, and you become less efficient. So the bottom line is here we have to help kids understand how their emotional feeling, their attitude toward a task affects the way they think about it. And I believe and know that kids can be taught the difference, but this is a very active process, and that's what makes it so difficult. So when you see and hear kids with ADHD who seem not to be motivated, it looks like they're sending the message, hey, I'm absolutely not interested in doing this. As long as you conceptualize lack of motivation in this way and don't factor in the influence of brain chemistry, then you're doing the kid no favors. You will be frustrated. You might even be angry at a kid, like, why can't you do this? You did this before. And you'll both have limited success. So here's what you've been waiting for, a quick fix. Well, not really a quick fix, but I want to give you time for questions and answers here. This is a long-term fix that happens over time. If you're a parent or a teacher or a mental health specialist, and here I say, it may take all three people because this is not going to be a quick fix. It won't be easy. It won't be fast. Here are the things you need to do. You need to name this. You need to make sure that kids know they have a condition that can make certain situations more challenging or more difficult. You have to help kids understand the reality that this condition is there. It is what it is. In order to do that, you have to explain it. You have to teach kids with ADHD that certain challenges they have are related to their condition. Their challenges in getting organized, at initiating or starting a task, their challenge in keeping the flow going and keeping irrelevant thoughts in the background, and their difficulty in completing a task are related to these conditions. We have to frame it. This doesn't mean you're not smart. This does mean your brain is working differently. This does mean ADHD can present a challenge, but it doesn't mean that it's a disability. It is a skill deficit. It can be overcome. It must be overcome if you want to achieve greater success and live up to your potential. And a lot of people who have this condition have done exactly that. We know that some people who have ADHD have the gift of self-awareness. They independently address and overcome their challenges. But for a lot of kids, it takes guidance, it takes education, and it takes practice. In order for a kid with ADHD to be successful, that is, be more motivated, he or she has to develop a sense of self-awareness or self-advocacy. They have to be able to think at some point, I have this condition. I can explain my condition to other people and what that looks like, and help them understand that what looks like poor motivation is often related to my ADHD. I understand that my cognitive style and my biochemistry are unlike that of others. I have to understand that this makes some tasks that are manageable for other people difficult for me. And I have to help people, and I understand that I might be more motivated by some tasks than other tasks. This has to do with how I feel about the task. This has to do with my mindset. So if you're my parent or my teacher, maybe you can help me change my mindset so I can be working from a place of strength. And yeah, I do want to strengthen my ability in this area. Most kids in private would say, if they could, I don't want to be like this. It's okay that I have the ADHD, but I don't want to deal with the consequences. I want to get better at this thing. These kids have to have the opportunity to acquire and use metacognitive strategies that can help them get over disorganization and distraction and improve their executive functioning. These are kids who have to be able ultimately to say to us, I am working on this, I am getting better because I'm putting effort into it. This is my challenge and I'm responding to it. Just like in sports or acting or any skill, most kids don't become proficient in this on their own. The mentor or coach in this case could be a parent, a teacher, a counselor, a good friend. These kids have to learn the value of honest self-appraisal. They have to learn how ultimately to accept and use feedback from other people, and they have to compare their current performance with their past performance and use the skills they've learned in the past to help them in the future. Two of the simplest things we can do for kids is to ask them whether they think, how difficult they think the task is that's put before them, and have it rated, have them rated, if you will, on a 1 to 5 scale, 1 being really easy and 5 being really hard. If we know that kids think the task is a 5-level task, we have to help them. We have to either make the task a little easier for them so they can feel success, or we have to have them help us change the task so it won't seem so hard. The second question we want to ask them is, how capable are you of doing this task, whether it's a level 1 task or a level 5 task? How capable do you think you are? If they say I'm not capable at all, we need to work on that self-perception and get a better balance between the difficulty level and the perception of competence. We have to help these kids find a community of support. We have to help them find other people, even people of other different ages who are working on or who have conquered this same lifetime goal. This could be an in-person community or an online community. A great resource for this is a group called Eye to Eye, and I've given you a reference for it down below. This is a non-profit group that provides mentee and mentor training to schools across the United States. It was founded by a guy named, it says David Link, but it should be David Flink, F-L-I-N-K. They have an app called the Empower app, and they have a video called Road Trip Nation. Go to the website called eye2eyenational.org and learn about them. They may be helpful for you, your kids, or your schools. Kids who have these challenges should be encouraged to log their accomplishment. Our brains love to avoid failure, but they really, really love success. So keep a record of the wins that you achieve or your child achieved. It's like putting ribbons and trophies on the wall of the bedroom of an athlete. That's part of what keeps people going. Our kids don't have a lot of trophies to put on their walls. Let's think about turning that around. Let's focus on process and not product. When you focus on the former, generally that leads to an improvement in the latter. I mentioned growth mindset before. Try to cultivate an I can and I will attitude versus I can't, so I won't. Get kids to externalize what their brains are saying to them at the beginning of the task and see if you can get them to change that message, at least for that task. We have to build in a lot more experiences than kids currently have to experience the joy and the good brain chemicals, the brain juice that comes from success. Let them do things they do well a lot and feel the joy of that sport, whether it's sports or music or theater, electronics, dance, writing lyrics to a song, doing poetry. All these things build good brain chemistry that make our brains more ready and more able to do the things that are more challenging for us. So let's put money in that bank if we can. And now it's time for some questions. So I'm going to turn the podium, if you will, over to Wayne to monitor those. And Wayne, take it away.
Okay. Excellent presentation, Jerry.
Thank you.
Very
Wayne.
enlightening for me. One mom has asked, does the differences in brain structure for kids that you outlined, dopamine transport, et cetera, do they change as they grow up? Do they improve, in other words, as children become adults?
That's a really good question because the brains of individuals aren't typically fully mature until the late stages of adolescence or early adulthood. So yes, those structures get better. And that's why some people have difficulty in school but don't have so much difficulty later in life when they choose something that they really have some degree of competence in. The part to remember that you can't just wait for biological development to make these things get better. You have to build a pathway. It's like putting bumpers on the side of a bowling alley lane to give kids a chance to feel success and to help them understand why, and then slowly take the bumpers away and let them try to play this game, if you will, without those additional supports and to take over control and to get a sense of control. Bottom line is, yes, they get better, but my advice is don't leave it to chance.
Right. Does rewarding behavior, several parents have asked this, constantly rewarding behavior work long term? This one mom mentioned, my son wants a prize as motivation to do each thing he's asked about, but this seems to be a dangerous precedent to me. So I don't know if you had any thoughts about that.
Wayne, I lost part of that last sentence. Say the last part of that question again.
It's about rewarding behavior. all the time, that the child becomes dependent on the reward rather than sort of the love of accomplishing something.
Right. Really important
And can
question.
that become a dangerous precedent is what I'm saying.
Exactly right. Oh, and you're right. It does, and you get into a situation where kids then won't do anything without a reward, and you find yourself as a parent or even a teacher just jacking up the value of the reward. You know, turning a quarter into $100 pretty quickly. There's pride in accomplishing things on your own, and it's important to focus on that for kids. I think it's an important question to ask of a kid. Again, how difficult is this task for you, and how do we modify that? Right? If it's a page full of math problems and the kid says, whoa, that's a 5-level difficulty, I can't do that, then the parent or teacher can say, well, let's give you one at a time. Would that make it seem less difficult? And the kid will generally say yes if you do things like that. And the other question, how able are you to do this? Most kids want to do things well, so they'll say, they might overestimate their ability to do it, or they may say, 1, I have no skill, or they may say, 5, I have a lot of skill. You have them do the task, and then when you go back into the task and you analyze it, you say, were you right? Was it as difficult as you thought? And then, were you right? Did you have as much or as little ability as you thought? And you need to get kids to continue to evaluate both the difficulty level of the task and their ability after they've done something successfully. That's how they build their own credits. You can also ask, I know this is very difficult for you. Is this something you can do on your own? Or do you think you can only do it with a reward? And if the kid says, oh, yeah, I know this game. Yes, I can only do it with a reward. And then you say, here are 3 rewards. If you pick a little reward and do it, that's a good thing. That's desirable. If you need to pick the big reward, you can do that. But I'm only going to give you 1 reward for this kind of task, and that's the first one, because once we demonstrate to you that you can do it, the reward will be doing it right, and that's what we're going for. So this, again, is not a quick fix item here, but you really have to get kids to the point of getting that feeling. You know what it's like for anybody to, if somebody gives you a problem that's a little bit challenging and you solve it, you feel good. You want to get kids at that point. You don't want to have them looking like a puppy for the treat in your pocket.
Right. A lot of questions about dopamine, since you mentioned it as being a key factor. Is there any way other than stimulants to increase the levels of dopamine in the brain?
Yeah, I preface that saying I'm not a medical doctor and I can't give medical advice, but one of the fastest ways to increase dopamine in the brain is to do things that make you happy and do healthy things that make you happy. If you take street drugs, you can increase the level of your dopamine, but that's something that you don't want to do. By running track, walking fast, you can increase the level of dopamines. By having successful experiences playing a game, you can increase your level of dopamines. So if you're trying to increase the level, and it happens pretty quickly in the human body and brain. So if you want to follow successful experience with challenging experience, your brain will have more dopamine in it at the time that you need it to have it. So yes, there are certainly non-chemical ways to do that.
Mm-hmm. What about stress in school? I know your whole book is about that, and kids, the stress over learning. And a couple of teachers have asked that basically a couple of their students, because they find learning so stressful because they failed or haven't met the challenges in the past, don't want to bother anymore. So one teacher asked if there's anything that she can do to relieve the stress for a couple of her students with ADHD who just feel demoralized and anxious about learning.
Yeah, an excellent question and an important one. You have to think about why these kids feel stressed about learning. My guess is that 2 things. One is that they have not had a lot of success, and nor have they known the joy and the physiological sensation that success brings them, or if they had, it's only been fleeting. The other factor that operates in a lot of kids, especially those who are more likely to be impulsive, they see a task And even though it's a task that may be within their zone of competence, they see it as a completely different challenge, and they go into high alert mode. Their stress level goes up because they're not seeing it as something that will give them pleasure. They are seeing it as something that will give them frustration, that will make them look stupid, that will make them feel bad again. So I think the idea of having individual students and groups of students first rate what they see as the perceived difficulty of the task. You can have a teacher in a classroom of 30 kids can have a little circle in the upper right-hand corner of the paper that they're working on and say to the kids, I want you to, first thing, before you pick up a pencil to do anything that's on this page, I want you to put down what you think is the difficulty level of the task. 1 means it's really easy and you will have no problems with it. 5 means it's really difficult. I'm going to walk around the room as you get started, and I'm going to look for 4s and 5s. I believe that this is a level 3 task, and that's why I gave it to everybody. But if you think it's a 4 or 5 task, you know, kids, that we've studied enough about how your brain reacts to stress that if you think it's a 4 or 5, that will get in the way of your cognitive abilities, your ability to do this well. Now, and the listener, please think about what I just said. That assumes that this brilliant, enlightened teacher has talked to all these kids early in the year about the impact of stress on cognitive functioning at a level that's developmentally appropriate, and you can talk about this with kids in kindergarten through college. And then you have kids monitor what their perception of the difficulty level is, and then you have them rate what they think their ability level is, and you help them narrow the difference between those. That will reduce the stress not by taking away the stressor, but by giving kids the ability to modify the power of the stimulus to make it seem or feel less stressful than their reactive, fear-focused brains are likely to do. And then afterwards, you do the same kind of rating that I talked about before. Okay, kids, some of you said this was a 4 or 5. Some of you said you didn't have a lot of ability. Now, in the little box below, I want you to tell me how your numbers compare. And make that analysis of the difficulty level and the confidence and competence level part of many assignments, especially at the beginning of the year or especially at the beginning of a unit of instruction, because those are times that trigger the fear response because the kid is saying, danger is coming, danger is coming. And you don't want to be in a position as a teacher to try to make that danger seem less. You want to be in a position of helping kids say, oh, that's not a poisonous snake. That's a twig on the path in front of me. What was I thinking? That's a gift that you can give kids. And you can do that in 1 year's time, but so that by the time they reach the next grade, they're going to be better able to do this, less stressed, and their brains are going to be working more in their favor. I believe, I hope you can tell it passionately about the potential of that.
Yes, I can hear the passion. That's excellent advice. I think the hour is about up, Jerry. So once again, lots of great questions, lots of great answers, but many left unanswered. So maybe sometime in the future we'll have you back if you consent at some point, and we'll go a little further with this. But thanks so much for being here and sharing your expertise. I know I learned a lot myself. So thanks again, Jerry.
And if you get me, send some of those questions ahead to me, and I'll take a look at them, and maybe we can think of some creative way to get the answers out to a lot of people.
Oh, yeah. That's a good idea. I'll do that. Right. And once again, for everyone, I have to remind everyone again that the sponsor was Esteem 5. It's a new app to give you insights and resources to meet important challenges as parents. This is a good time probably to log on to chooseesteem.com, and you'll have a free trial of this great new app. So you can always try it and see how it works for you. And I wanted to remind everyone that next week we'll address another important topic, how to help your high school student advocate for him or herself in college. Advocacy is a key life skill, and research shows that it makes all the difference between making it in college or dropping out. So we'll see you next week, September 5th, and have a great day, everyone.